Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. I'm reading the entire 2025 Booker Prize longlist, and in this video I've got 4 reviews of nominated books to share with you, and we're going to start with Seascraper by Benjamin Wood. This is a slip of a novel, and it centres Thomas, a young man living in the northeast of England with his mother. And every morning he prepares his horse and cart and he heads out onto the misty beach into that shifting boundary between land and sea, scraping for shrimp, which is his family's main source of income. I'll say right up front that one of this book's superpowers is its atmosphere. The environment and Thomas's way of life that is tied to it, it's written in a way that is utterly transportive. The damp, the drudgery, the heaviness of the mist, the looming tide and the lurking danger of sinkholes. You feel like you are out there on the beach with him. This sea scraping is a trade that Thomas has inherited from his grandfather, who raised him until his death. His father was never really in the picture, and his mother had him very young. She's only 36, but the life she's had makes her feel in herself much older. She's worn down and she's carrying the responsibility of raising a son alone. And although she's only fleetingly in the pages of this book, Benjamin Wood creates a really striking portrait of a woman who loves her child but has been aged by circumstance. There's a neat comparison here to another book on the Booker longlist, Love Forms by Claire Adam. That book gives us the perspective of a woman who gave up the child that she had at 16, while here we see a parallel life of sorts of someone who kept and raised her child. But back to Thomas, and he doesn't really want to be a shrimper. What he wants to do is to sing. Like, he has secretly bought himself a guitar that he's teaching himself to play, and he's dreaming of doing something that will take other people's breath away. At one point in the book, he jokes that nobody will ever be left breathless by the sight of him like scraping shrimp out on the beach. Although, ironically, that is exactly what happens. Because one day, an American filmmaker called Edgar turns up. He's this brash, bolshy guy. He turns up with stakes in hand as a bit of a sweetener, and he offers money in exchange for Thomas's help scouting the shoreline as a film location. Edgar had seen Thomas out on the beach, and he'd been stunned by the beauty of the image, thrilled at the possibility of finding a fit for his cinematic vision. From there, the novel is much pacier and more plot-driven than I expected. There are some twists and turns, some moments of real high drama, and sections that I just flew through. There are also some dream and hallucinatory sequences. Normally these aren't massively my thing, but here they surprised me and worked really well because they very much fit the novel's mood. The silhouette of Thomas's absent father lingers on the walls of this book, not least because Thomas wonders if his artistic side comes from his dad. He didn't know his father, but this guy was once his mother's teacher, later killed in the war. That sense of inheritance, both wanted and unwanted, runs through the book in many different ways. I listened to the audiobook and read this one physically at the same time, and it was a really wonderful experience that I would highly recommend. Benjamin Wood narrates it himself, and he even sings a song that he wrote for the book. If you are reading it only in print though, there is a URL written at the back of the book, so you can type that in and listen to the song for yourself once you're done with the book. The whole thing strangely reminded me of The Safekeep, in that it has this same quality of feeling like a lost classic, something old-fashioned in the best way, just a great story, really, really well told. I have to admit though, it might be partly because both The Safekeep and Seascraper were published by Viking and they're set in the same typeface, so I don't know, maybe it was just something about reading a page that looks and feels the same. But I do maintain that they've got that real classic quality to them. Overall, I absolutely adored this book. I think it is a fantastic addition to the longlist. Next then, I read Misinterpretation by Ledia Xhoga. This is a novel about an Albanian interpreter living in New York. Her job is to be a blank slate, to pass words from one language to another without leaving much of a trace of herself. But the problem is she can't help getting drawn into her clients' lives. The book opens in a park where she is meeting a man called Alfred, who she accompanies to the dentist. He's nervous, almost terrified because of torture that he's suffered in his past. And she knows that she should keep a professional distance, especially when he asks her to keep helping him afterwards. One of the first rules that she learns as an interpreter in her training was that if your circumstances are similar to someone else's, then you shouldn't interpret for them. And yet, despite the fact that her life does overlap with Alfred's, especially with their mother's experiences, she doesn't keep her distance. She ignores the warning that she's had. This blurring of the boundary between right and wrong, what she should do and what she shouldn't, is one of many in the book, between one language and another, between love and violence, and between safety and danger. At home, she's married to a white American man, but theirs is a strange and strained relationship. Over the course of the novel, she entangles herself more deeply in other people's lives, and her own marriage becomes increasingly difficult. At first, I was really taken with this. I love when a novel takes a central theme and slathers it on thickly everywhere. And here I kept seeing interpretation in many aspects of the book, not just in language, but in gestures, in environments, across cultures. And these gaps in meaning between what's said and what's heard, between what's intended and what's understood, they're often really fascinating and thought-provoking little moments that you stop and you think about. But sadly, I didn't feel that this book really built on that early promise. I grew very tired of the characters because their motivations often felt muddy and their actions didn't always make sense. And I think perhaps I'm just a little bit weary of this type of story where a character stands between cultures and they're emotionally detached, drifting with the current, giving into impulses that lead to trouble. I had recently read The Coin by Yasmin Zaher, which I found very, very similar to this actually. There's lots of parallels, but I found that book equally frustrating. I don't think centering passivity is necessarily a problem. In fact, I think it can be really powerful, but when it works, the execution has to be super sharp. The characters still need to feel convincing and their inner lives need to be well drawn. For me, simply leaning on the idea of cultural estrangement, of not saying much more than it's difficult to not belong anywhere, it just isn't enough to carry a novel. The plotting was another issue I had with the book. There are storylines that are dropped, characters who appear once and then never resurface. And I did later read that the book was originally conceived as a dual perspective novel and that fragments of the two points of view were later stitched together into one, and I think that might explain why sometimes it feels a bit disjointed or incomplete. There are lots of thoughts here that aren't rounded off, they aren't circled back to. There was also this mystery subplot, and although there was no big reveal, by the end I was left with an idea of what I think had really happened, but it made earlier actions by the characters involved make absolutely no sense at all. Bamboozlement of your readers can be good, but it didn't feel purposeful or artful here as it did, for instance, when I was reading Audition by Katie Kitamura. So overall, I came away a bit disappointed. There were ideas here that I thought could have made for a really compelling novel, but for me, the execution just didn't quite do it justice. Next then, I read The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. If you saw my Booker longlist reaction video, you might remember that I had a copy of this from the library that was due back the very next day. I sadly didn't get to it in time then, but I did then go on to find this copy of The Land in Winter in a charity shop for £4, so I think the stars just aligned for me. This one is the latest novel from Andrew Miller, who has been shortlisted for the Booker before, and he's already won the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction with this book, and that was from a very, very strong shortlist, including some all-time faves for me, like Glorious Exploits and Mother Naked. This book is set at the end of 1962 and the beginning of 1963, during one of the coldest winters on record, and it's set in Bristol and a nearby village. I suppose I should confess right away that living in Bristol absolutely biases me towards liking this book. There's a very shallow thrill in reading about places that you know and streets that you frequently wander down, especially when they are rendered with some authenticity. Anyway, at the centre of this novel are two married couples, Eric and Irene, and Bill and Rita. Eric is the village GP, the doctor that looks after everyone, and Bill is a farmer, though he's a bit of a novice because he took up the profession after he turned his back on his wealthy family. The two women, they stay at home, but they strike up an unlikely but important friendship, not least because they've got something quite plot important in common. Interestingly though, the novel opens not with any of these characters. It actually opens elsewhere in an asylum where there is a character connected to this core quartet who discovers the body of a young patient who has taken his own life. The relevance of this opening does gently reveal itself, but it's not a plot-driven novel. What it's really about are the characters, their interior lives, the ways they connect and disconnect from one another. But when dramatic events do arrive, they are handled with so much writerly skill. There is one high-stakes incident told with complete deadpan restraint, and another heartbreaking moment right at the end that Miller lingers on just the perfect amount of time, and it had a real emotional impact on me. Part of why this book works is its pacing. It's told in 3 parts. Part 1 is slow and establishing as we get to know the characters. I will admit that reading 2 white married couples of similar ages did leave me getting their stories a little bit mixed up at times. But I'm glad the book took its time to let them settle in my mind, because in the second part, the pace picks up. Miller starts jumping between the characters every few pages, and that lends the book a sense of urgency, despite it not being very plot-driven, and it keeps you moving through the book. Crucially, every perspective here was equally compelling for me. There wasn't one character that I was rushing to get past in order to get back to another. That balance feels essential to the book's success. The writing is absolutely beautiful. It's very detailed, but it's so well observed and it brings the characters to life. But at times it's also just breathtaking. Take this passage, for instance. He left the city by the Bath Road. He passed the gates of the hillside cemetery where his father slept, where his father would wake at the last trump, where he rotted, where he was nothing, where he was a stone in the winter grass in a row of other stones. Like, that was just in the middle of Eric taking a car journey somewhere and it just walloped me across the face. Or, for instance, this, where he's just describing the colour of a car. The car was the purple of an aubergine. It was purple soaked in itself, a purple surface with purple depths, though someone had plumbed them, perhaps with the edge of a coin, a sequence of gouged lines on the driver's side of the bonnet. It's just really, really good writing. Miller also knows how to work a scene. There is a very entertaining Boxing Day party in the middle of the book that is great fun. One other strength of the novel for me was how the Second World War kind of hangs out in the background. At the time of the events of this novel, it's almost 20 years since World War II ended, but the privation of rationing still lingers, and you have some people desperate to completely forget about the war while others still talk about it because it's a formative milestone of their lives. The central cast also have some connections to the war which are interesting and help explain different aspects of their character. I had expected going into this that the novel would use this historically severe winter as a way of trapping the characters together, forcing them into close quarters to face truths that they couldn't escape. But in fact, when the storm comes, Miller sends them off in different directions. The cold forces solitude rather than confinement, and it's in those spaces apart where they reckon with their lives. I flew through this, and for the most part I loved it, but I did struggle a little bit with the ending. It's very abrupt and it leaves so much unresolved. I think Miller might be reaching for the sense that life simply goes on. The final section is even titled Live Your Life. But for me, it didn't quite land. Part 3 is much shorter and it felt like it should have functioned as a coda to the novel. It would have been really effective had it drawn the threads together. But instead, it introduces fresh events, fresh variables right at the very end. Personally, I would have happily read another 100 pages of this novel if Miller had more story to tell. But sadly, it just ends like quite suddenly. Still, I really enjoyed it. I think it's a very accomplished book and I can see why it's had a lot of praise heaped upon it. Very good stuff. I'm going to finish then with another book that I had read before the longlist announcement, which is Flesh by David Szalay. You might remember he was once controversially shortlisted for the Booker with a collection of short stories, but this time there is no debate. This is definitely a full novel and well within the eligibility criteria of the prize. It opens with Istvan as a teenager in Hungary, and we bear witness to a formative relationship that he has, which is probably better described as abuse. His neighbour, an older woman, gives him his first sexual experiences, engineering these encounters that have the illusion of consent, but given this specific age gap and the power imbalance, can never really be acceptable. It is actually quite interesting to reflect on how much more shocking this setup might have felt had the genders been reversed, and I wonder if this is a purposeful provocation by Szalay. Anyway, although Istvan doesn't feel attracted to his neighbour, he comes to crave these encounters, depend on them almost, until it builds to a shocking conclusion. And that early experience lingers, it leaves a mark on how he relates to women for the rest of his life. You can almost feel its shadow in every intimacy he has as he grows older. I think what the novel is trying to do here is show how Istvan learns passivity. He has the teenage affect of not caring, of going along with things, and then when he does care and he does take action, it all goes horribly wrong. So for the rest of his life, he becomes something of a passenger. The rest of the book follows him across decades, moving to England, drifting through different jobs, scraping by and then suddenly brushing up against wealth until he eventually becomes part of that world himself. The style is what really stands out here. It's very pared back, somewhat emotionally stunted. This comes through strongest in the dialogue, which is full of monosyllabic interactions. The word okay is used 340 times in the book, and sure is used 154 times. I read it digitally, so I could look that up. That passivity, that refusal to say anything directly, it can be infuriating, and yet it also is what makes the book so compelling, because Szalay manages to pack meaning into those silences, into those clipped words. It feels true to the way some people talk around things rather than going directly through them. The structure of the book adds a sense of life passing by like a train, and we only get to get onto Istvan's carriage at a few different stops. Each chapter is like a snapshot. It's a glimpse of him at a particular moment. There are huge gaps between the chapters, but instead of spelling things out and explaining at the start of each one all the events that happened in between, Szalay lets you intuit what must have happened through the way that he shows you things. I found that to be really effective. Istvan's life is very eventful, sometimes almost improbably so, but that didn't really bother me here. I think the emotional reality always felt convincing even when the plot points didn't. And across it all there is this ongoing question of masculinity. Istvan's passivity, his uneasy relationship with women, his shifting sense of power and success. The novel is probing what it means to be a man and whether being a good man can be a stable idea in the first place. The unadorned style is the thing that will be left in your mind here though, and on the surface it feels like it shouldn't work. Underneath that surface though, it's alive with meaning, and I found it oddly hypnotic. For me, Flesh was a solid read, sometimes frustrating, sometimes unlikely, but oddly captivating. It's a novel that lingers because of the questions it asks, not the answers that it provides. I very much enjoyed it. So that wraps up another 4 reviews from this year's Booker long list. I'm going to be reading and reviewing all of the books. I've got 3 more to read, so I'm hoping that I can get those done before the shortlist announcement, although 2 of the 3 are the longest books from the list this year. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments if you read any of the ones that I talked about today and what you thought of them. Did your opinions align with mine, or did we have a different view of these books? If you did enjoy this video, please do hit like. It always really helps the channel out, and there is more Booker review content coming, so if you'd like that to appear in your subscriptions feed, then hit the subscribe button. But until next time, toodles.